The sun was just beginning to set over the Normandy countryside, casting long shadows across the fields and the dusty road where we marched. I was Private James Bennett, part of an Allied infantry unit moving towards what we only knew as a strategic point near Falaise. The echoes of D-Day were still fresh, a blend of victory and uncertainty hanging in the air. We had been marching for hours, our boots kicking up clouds of dust, the weight of our gear growing with each step. Sergeant Richard Dawson, whom we all called Rick, led the way, his gaze fixed on the horizon. A seasoned veteran, Rick's presence was a constant source of reassurance. He had a way of making you feel like everything would be all right, even when you knew it might not be. Next to me was Corporal Anna Dubois, a member of the French resistance attached to our unit. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the landscape, ever vigilant. There was something about Anna that was both intriguing and intimidating. Perhaps it was her unwavering determination or the way she spoke about her homeland with a fierce passion. "Keep your heads up, boys and girls," Rick called back to us. "We don't know what's waiting for us at Falaise, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." His words were meant to be encouraging, but they sent a shiver down my spine. The unknown was always the most frightening part of war. You could train for combat, but you could never fully prepare for the unpredictability of the battlefield. As we marched, the chatter among the unit dwindled, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I thought about home, about the life I'd left behind, and the reasons I'd chosen to fight. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and in many ways it was. War had a way of changing you, of reshaping your understanding of the world. The landscape around us was a mix of beauty and desolation. Fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, interspersed with the scars of war, bombed-out buildings and craters from artillery shells. It was a stark reminder of why we were here, of the cost of this war that had engulfed the world. As night began to fall, we reached a small village, the first sign of civilization we'd seen in hours. The villagers watched us warily as we passed through, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resilience. I couldn't help but wonder about their stories, about the hardships they must have faced since the war began. We set up camp on the outskirts of the village, the sense of urgency palpable among the unit. Tomorrow, we would reach the Falaise Pocket. None of us knew exactly what awaited us there, but we all understood that it was a crucial point in this campaign. The tension was like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. That night, as I lay in my tent, staring up at the canvas ceiling, I thought about the days ahead. I thought about my family, my friends, and the life I hoped to return to. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Dawn broke with a chill in the air, the first light of day casting a pale glow over our makeshift camp. We were roused from our tents before the sun fully revealed itself, the urgency of our mission allowing no luxury of rest. As we packed our gear, Sergeant Dawson's voice cut through the morning mist. "Listen up," he said, his tone more serious than the day before. "Intelligence suggests heavy German presence near Falaise. We're walking into a lion's den. Stay sharp and stick together." His words hung heavily over us as we resumed our march. The countryside, bathed in the soft light of dawn, seemed eerily tranquil, a stark contrast to the tension that gripped our unit. Beside me, Corporal Anna Dubois moved with a silent grace, her eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. Her presence was a reminder of the stakes at hand. This was her country, her home. We were fighting to liberate. The rhythmic thud of our boots on the road formed a monotonous soundtrack to our thoughts. My mind wandered to my family, to the last letter I'd received from them, filled with words of love and worry. I clung to those words, a lifeline in the uncertainty that lay ahead. As the day progressed, the terrain became more challenging. We navigated through dense woodlands, the trees standing tall and unyielding, their leaves whispering secrets of battles past. The weight of history was palpable, each step forward a step deeper into the heart of conflict. Lieutenant David Miller, our unit leader, marched at the front with Sergeant Dawson. Though young, Miller had a calm and collected demeanor, his decisions measured and thoughtful. He often conferred with Dawson, valuing the sergeant's experience and insight. The camaraderie within the unit was a source of comfort. Medic Joseph Kelly, known to us as Joe, kept our spirits up with his jokes, even in the bleakest of times. His laughter was a balm, a brief escape from the reality of war. Private Thomas Reed, the youngest among us, walked with wide-eyed determination. His innocence was a stark reminder of all that war could steal away. I found myself watching over him, a protective instinct I didn't know I possessed. As we neared our destination, the signs of war became more pronounced. The distant rumble of artillery, the acrid smell of smoke on the wind. The landscape bore the scars of conflict, the once pristine fields now marred by the brutality of war. In the late afternoon, we reached a vantage point overlooking the Falaise Pocket. The view that unfolded before us was one of strategic importance and imminent danger. The town of Falaise, with its historic buildings and narrow streets, lay in the valley below, surrounded by German forces. Lieutenant Miller called a halt, his eyes surveying the landscape with a strategic gaze. "This is it," he said, "the Falaise Pocket. Tomorrow we move in. Rest up tonight. We'll need every ounce of strength and courage come dawn." As night descended, we set up camp in the shelter of the woods, the reality of what awaited us casting a shadow over our hearts. I lay in my tent, the sounds of my fellow soldiers' quiet conversations, a reminder that I wasn't alone in my fears. Tomorrow, we would step into the unknown, into the heart of the battle for Falaise. And as I closed my eyes, I held on to the hope that we would all emerge on the other side, together. The morning air was tense with anticipation as we prepared to move out. Today, we would edge closer to the Falaise Pocket, and the likelihood of encountering German forces was high. Lieutenant Miller's briefing was brief and to the point, his usual calmness underscored by a palpable sense of urgency. "We'll be advancing in a staggered formation," Miller instructed. "Keep your eyes peeled and your weapons ready. The Germans won't give us an easy pass." As we set off, the forest seemed to close in around us, a natural labyrinth that both shielded and concealed dangers. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves formed a deceptive backdrop to our cautious advance. I found myself walking near Corporal Dubois. Her expression was focused, betraying no sign of fear, only a resolute determination. Her presence was a silent reassurance, a reminder of the strength we all carried within us. The first sign of trouble came without warning. A crack of a twig, a rustle of movement, and then the sudden, ear-splitting crack of gunfire. Instinctively, we hit the ground, our training kicking in amidst the chaos. "Contact right!" Dawson's voice cut through the gunfire. "Return fire!" The forest erupted into a frenzy of bullets and shouts. I crawled to a nearby tree, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered around its trunk. Through the foliage, I could see the flashes of enemy rifles. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil jolting through my arm, my focus narrowing to the task at hand. Around me, my unit responded with disciplined fire, a united front against the unseen enemy. Beside me, Dubois fired her rifle with calm precision, her every move deliberate and efficient. The intensity in her eyes was a stark contrast to the chaos around us. The skirmish was intense but brief. The German patrol, likely just as surprised as we were, retreated under our sustained fire. As the last echoes of gunfire faded, a heavy silence settled over the forest. We regrouped, checking for injuries. By some miracle, we had all come through unscathed. The realization that we had survived our first encounter with the enemy was both a relief and a sobering reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Dawson conferred quickly before issuing new orders. "We can't stay here," Miller said. "We need to keep moving, stay off the predictable paths. The enemy knows we're here now." As we resumed our march, the forest seemed even more ominous than before. The initial encounter had stripped away any remaining illusions of safety. Every shadow, every sound now carried the weight of potential threat. Private Reed's eyes were wide, the reality of combat settling in. I clapped him on the shoulder, offering a silent show of support. He nodded, swallowing hard, and tightened his grip on his rifle. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and vigilance. As evening approached, we found a secluded area to set up a temporary camp. The events of the day weighed heavily on us, the adrenaline of combat giving way to exhaustion. As I lay in my tent that night, the sounds of the forest around me, I couldn't shake the image of Dubois' focused expression during the firefight. In her, I saw the embodiment of our mission, not just a fight against an enemy, but a fight for something greater, a fight for freedom. The dawn of the new day brought with it a palpable shift in our mission. The encounter with the German patrol had been a stark awakening. We were now deep in enemy territory, and every step forward was laden with risk. Lieutenant Miller's morning briefing was terse. "Intelligence confirms we're closing in on the Falaise Pocket," he said, his eyes scanning our faces. "Our goal is to tighten the noose around the German forces. Remember, this isn't just about engaging the enemy. It's about strategic positioning." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The Falaise Pocket was more than a battlefield. It was a pivotal point in the Normandy campaign. The thought of being part of such a crucial operation was both daunting and exhilarating. As we broke camp, Sergeant Dawson pulled me aside. "Stay sharp, Bennett," he advised, his voice low. "The real fight's just beginning. You did good yesterday, but today's a new day." I nodded, feeling the gravity of his words. Dawson had a way of instilling confidence and caution in equal measure. We moved out in a tight formation, the forest around us a maze of shadows and light. Corporal Dubois was a constant presence by my side, her vigilant gaze sweeping the terrain. The march was slow and methodical. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant sound was a potential threat. The tension was like a tightrope, each of us balancing on the edge of vigilance and fear. Mid-morning, we reached a ridge overlooking a valley. Through binoculars, we could see the German forces in the distance. Their encampment sprawled in the heart of the pocket. The sight of the enemy so close, yet so unaware of our presence, was a surreal experience. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Dawson assessed the situation. "This is it," Miller said. "We'll move into positions around the perimeter. Our job is to cut off any German attempt to break out." The unit split into smaller groups, each tasked with securing a section of the perimeter. Dubois and I were assigned to Dawson's team, tasked with covering a critical approach to the north. As we took our positions, the reality of our task became clear. We were part of a larger strategy, a cog in the machine that was the Allied effort to crush the German forces in Normandy. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. We watched and waited, our eyes fixed on the landscape before us. The occasional distant boom of artillery was a reminder of the larger battle unfolding around us. In the lull, I found myself talking to Dubois. She spoke of her home, of the France she remembered before the war. Her words painted a picture of a peaceful life, so starkly different from the present. As the sun began to set, the forest around us took on a haunting quality. The knowledge that we were surrounded by enemy forces was ever present, a silent adversary in its own right. That night, As I lay in my makeshift shelter, the sounds of the forest were a stark contrast to the silence of our watchful vigil. I thought of my family, of the world beyond the war, and I wondered what the coming days would bring as we tightened the noose around the Falaise Pocket. The following day dawned with a heavy mist shrouding the landscape, lending an eerie stillness to the early morning hours. Our orders were clear: maintain our positions and be ready for any attempt by the German forces to break out of the encirclement. As the mist began to lift, the tension among us intensified. We knew that the coming hours could decide the fate of the Falaise Pocket, and with it, a significant portion of the German army in Normandy. Lieutenant Miller moved among us, his presence a steady calm amidst the growing storm. "Stay alert," he reminded us. "The enemy is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." I found myself peering into the distance, trying to penetrate the veil of trees and undergrowth that obscured our view. Beside me, Corporal Dubois was a silent sentinel, her eyes never straying from the task at hand. The first sign of movement came mid-morning. A distant rumbling, growing steadily louder, heralded the approach of German tanks and infantry, attempting to forge a path out of the pocket. "Sergeant Dawson, take your team and flank them on the right." Miller's voice crackled over the radio. "We need to push them back at all costs." As Dawson led us into position, the forest erupted into chaos. The sound of gunfire, the roar of engines, and the shouts of men in combat filled the air. We engaged the enemy with fierce determination, the training and discipline of our unit holding firm against the onslaught. I fired round after round, each shot a desperate bid to halt the advancing troops. In the midst of the firefight, I caught a glimpse of Dubois. She was a force unto herself, moving with lethal precision as she took down enemy soldiers who dared to breach our line. The battle raged for hours, a relentless exchange of fire and fury. The ground around us was churned into mud, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the enemy's push faltered. The German forces, realizing the futility of their assault, began to retreat back into the pocket. We held our position, watching warily as the remnants of the enemy force disappeared into the forest. The silence that followed the battle was deafening, a stark contrast to the hellish inferno we had just endured. As we regrouped, the cost of the engagement became apparent. We had suffered casualties, each loss a heavy blow to our unit. Medic Joseph Kelly moved among the wounded, his face a mask of concentration as he tended to their injuries. That night, as we camped in the shadow of the day's battle, the mood was somber. We had held our ground, but at a cost. The reality of war, with its brutal toll, was an ever-present companion. I lay awake, the events of the day replaying in my mind. The faces of fallen comrades, the sounds of battle, the determination in Dubois' eyes, all etched into my memory. The Falaise Pocket was a crucible, a test of our resolve and courage. And as I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, I knew that the days ahead would bring more challenges, more battles, but we would face them together, as a unit, as a band of brothers and sisters in arms. The aftermath of the fierce battle left an indelible mark on our spirits. As dawn broke over the ravaged landscape, the true cost of the previous day's conflict became painfully apparent. The ground was littered with the remnants of the fight, a grim testament to the ferocity of the struggle for the Falaise Pocket. Lieutenant Miller convened a brief meeting as we prepared to resume our positions. His words were a mix of commiseration for our losses and encouragement for the days ahead. "We've held the line," he stated firmly, "but this isn't over yet. Stay sharp." As we took up our positions, the forest seemed to bear the scars of the previous day's battle. Trees were splintered and scorched, and the earth was churned and pocked with craters. The air still held a faint tang of smoke. Mid-morning, while patrolling a particularly dense section of the woods, we stumbled upon a wounded German soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied. He was young, not much older than Private Reed, and his eyes were wide with fear and pain. Medic Kelly approached cautiously, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "He needs help," Kelly said, looking back at us. "I can't just leave him here." The decision to aid an enemy soldier was fraught with complexity, but in that moment, it felt like the only humane choice. We formed a protective circle as Kelly tended to the young man's wounds. As he worked, the German soldier muttered a few words in broken English, expressing his thanks. His gratitude, despite the circumstances, was a poignant reminder of the shared humanity that existed even amidst the horrors of war. Corporal Dubois watched the scene with a complex expression, her usual stoicism tinged with a hint of reluctant empathy. "In another life, he could have been one of us," she murmured. Once Kelly had stabilized the soldier, we faced a new dilemma: what to do with him. Lieutenant Miller, after a brief radio consultation, decided we would take him as a prisoner of war. "We'll hand him over to the higher-ups," he said. "Let them decide his fate." As we resumed our march, the incident lingered in my mind. In the midst of all the destruction and enmity, that brief encounter was a stark reminder of the individual lives caught up in the maelstrom of war. Throughout the day, the fighting continued, though less intensely than before. The German attempts to break through our lines became increasingly sporadic and disorganized, a sign that their resolve was weakening. That evening, as we gathered around a small fire, the mood was contemplative. The day's events had opened a window to the more human side of this conflict, a side that was often overshadowed by the overarching narrative of war. Private Reed broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "Do you ever think about who they are?" he asked. "The guys on the other side?" His question hung in the air, and one by one we shared our thoughts. Each perspective was different, but all were tinged with a sense of weariness and a longing for an end to the fighting. As I settled into my makeshift bed, I thought about the German soldier we had encountered. In his eyes, I had seen fear, pain, and a glimmer of gratitude, emotions that transcended sides and uniforms. In that moment, our shared humanity had been laid bare, a fleeting connection in the midst of a hellish inferno. The next day brought with it an air of inevitability. We knew the Germans were growing increasingly desperate to break the encirclement, and we braced for an assault that felt certain to come. Lieutenant Miller's morning briefing was grim, yet motivational. "Intelligence suggests a major push from the Germans today," he announced. "They're throwing everything they have to break out of the pocket. We need to hold our ground at all costs." The forest, once a place of natural tranquility, now felt like a dormant beast, waiting to erupt into violence. We took our positions, the weight of our rifles a familiar comfort in our hands. The enemy's assault began just after midday, a thunderous barrage of artillery shaking the earth beneath our feet. Through the trees, we could see masses of German troops advancing, their desperation palpable even from a distance. "We're in for it now," Sergeant Dawson muttered, his eyes scanning the approaching threat. "Stay sharp and hold the line." The battle that ensued was like nothing we had experienced before. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of men. We fired relentlessly, each shot a desperate attempt to stem the tide of the advancing enemy. In the chaos, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Corporal Dubois, her figure a blur of motion as she engaged the enemy. Her bravery under fire was a beacon of inspiration, driving us to fight with everything we had. The forest around us transformed into a nightmarish landscape, shrouded in smoke and littered with the casualties of war. Time seemed to distort, the battle raging on in what felt like an endless loop of violence. At one point, a shell exploded nearby, sending a shower of dirt and debris over us. I felt a sharp pain in my arm and realized I'd been hit by a fragment. The pain was intense, but adrenaline kept me focused on the fight. Medic Kelly, ever present in the midst of battle, quickly bandaged my wound, his hand steady despite the chaos around us. "You're good, Bennett," he shouted over the din. "Keep fighting." As the day wore on, the German onslaught began to wane. Their initial vigor gave way to fatigue and dwindling numbers, their desperate bid for freedom crumbling under the might of our defense. By late afternoon, the forest fell silent, the enemy's retreat as abrupt as their attack. We remained in our positions, too exhausted to celebrate, our minds and bodies pushed to their limits. The aftermath was a somber affair. We collected our wounded and paid our respects to those we had lost. The reality of war was never more apparent than in these quiet moments, the joy of victory overshadowed by the cost at which it came. That night, as we rested in our camp, the events of the day weighed heavily on us. The forest seemed to mourn with us, its whispers a lament for the fallen. I lay awake, my arm throbbing in pain, my mind replaying the day's battle. The intensity of the fighting, the losses we suffered, and the sheer ferocity of the enemy's assault were overwhelming. Yet, amidst the turmoil, there was a sense of accomplishment. We had held the line against seemingly insurmountable odds, a testament to our unit's courage and resolve. As I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, I knew that the battle for the Falaise Pocket was far from over. But I also knew that we, as a unit, were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in our determination to see this through to the end. The relentless pace of battle left little time for reflection, yet as dawn crept over the beleaguered landscape of the Falaise Pocket, it brought with it a somber opportunity to assess the toll the conflict had taken on us. Lieutenant Miller's face was etched with fatigue as he addressed us in the dim morning light. "We've inflicted significant damage on the enemy," he began, his voice carrying a mix of pride and sorrow. "But this victory has come at a high cost. The previous day's battle had decimated parts of our unit. We had lost good soldiers, friends who had become like family over the course of the campaign. The reality of their absence was a heavy shadow over our hearts. Sergeant Dawson, usually a pillar of strength, seemed particularly affected. "We're going to honor their memory by finishing what we started here," he said, his voice tinged with a rare tremor of emotion. Corporal Dubois was quiet, her usual fiery demeanor subdued. The losses had touched us all, but for her, fighting on her home soil, each loss seemed to carry a deeper significance. As we resumed our positions, the forest felt hauntingly empty, the echoes of the departed lingering in the air. The German forces, now significantly weakened, were trapped, their desperation palpable even from a distance. The day passed with sporadic skirmishes, the enemy making futile attempts to break through our lines. Each encounter was a grim reminder of the ongoing struggle, a dance of death that continued to claim lives on both sides. In the late afternoon, as I was scanning the tree line, a sudden movement caught my eye. A German soldier, young and evidently terrified, was attempting to surrender. His hands trembled as he dropped his weapon, his eyes wide with fear. The sight of the young enemy soldier, so clearly out of his depth, struck a chord within me. It was a stark reminder that the enemy was not a faceless force, but comprised individuals, each with their own stories and fears. That evening, as we gathered around a small fire, the atmosphere was reflective. Private Reed, the innocence in his eyes now dimmed by the realities of war, spoke up. "Does it ever end?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The fighting, the dying? His question hung in the air, unanswerable. We each knew the war would continue, its end a distant hope on the horizon. As I lay in my tent, nursing my wounded arm and the weariness in my soul, I thought about the young German soldier. In his eyes, I had seen a mirror of our own fears and uncertainties. The war had brought us to the Falaise Pocket, a place of strategic importance, but it had also brought us face to face with the human cost of conflict. Our resolve was unwavering, but so too was our hope for an end to the bloodshed. That night, as I drifted into a restless sleep, I realized that the battle we were fighting was not just against an enemy force. It was a battle against the despair and desolation that war brought, a fight to maintain our humanity amidst the inferno. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes decisive moments in history. We knew the endgame for the Falaise Pocket was near. The German forces, battered and significantly reduced, were on the brink of collapse. Lieutenant Miller's briefing was succinct. "Today, we close the pocket," he declared. "We've got them surrounded. Let's end this." Our spirits, though dampened by the losses we'd endured, were buoyed by the prospect of concluding this grueling chapter of the campaign. The thought of finally sealing the Falaise Pocket and trapping the remnants of the German army brought a mix of relief and resolve. As we moved into position, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the early morning mist shrouding the trees in a ghostly veil. Sergeant Dawson, his face set in a grim mask, led our unit with a quiet determination. Corporal Dubois, her resilience unwavering, moved with a focused purpose. "Today, we liberate more than just this land," she said, her voice steady. "We reclaim hope." The final push was a coordinated effort with all Allied units converging to tighten the noose around the enemy. The sounds of battle filled the air, a cacophony of gunfire, artillery, and the shouts of men. As we advanced, the resistance from the German troops grew increasingly sporadic, their desperation evident in their haphazard attacks. The realization that they were trapped, with no hope of escape, had clearly taken its toll. The fighting was intense but short-lived. By midday, the resistance crumbled, the German soldiers either surrendering or falling in the fight. The Falaise Pocket, a symbol of relentless conflict, had finally been closed. In the aftermath, the scene was one of utter devastation. The forest and fields were scarred and littered with the remnants of war. The cost of victory was written in the wreckage and in the faces of the men and women who had fought so valiantly. As we regrouped, Lieutenant Miller addressed us, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "You've all fought bravely," he said. "This victory is a testament to your courage and determination. But remember, it's just one battle in a much larger war." The mood among the unit was subdued as we processed the events of the day. The victory was significant, but it was also a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle and the many battles yet to be fought. That evening, as we camped amidst the ruins of the battlefield, there was a sense of reflective quietude. We shared stories of the fallen, remembering their bravery and mourning their loss. Private Reed, his youthful optimism forever altered by the realities of war, sat silently, staring into the fire. "It's over," he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else. "At least here, it's over." As I lay in my tent that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The Falaise Pocket was closed, but the war was far from over. Yet, in that moment, there was a sense of accomplishment, a fleeting respite in the storm of conflict. We had faced hell on earth and emerged victorious, but at a cost that would stay with us forever. As I closed my eyes, I hoped for a future where such sacrifices would no longer be necessary, where peace would prevail over the inferno of war. As the sun rose over the scarred landscape of the Falaise Pocket, It cast a new light on the world around us. The battle was over, but its echoes lingered in the air, in the earth, and in our hearts. Lieutenant Miller gathered us for a final debriefing. His words were not just of congratulations for our success, but also of remembrance for those we had lost. "We've achieved a significant victory," he said solemnly. "But let's not forget the price paid for it. Honor those who can't celebrate with us today." The clearing we stood in was a stark reminder of the battle's ferocity. Craters pocked the ground, trees stood splintered and broken, and the remnants of war lay scattered around. This place would forever bear the scars of the conflict it had witnessed. As we prepared to leave the Falaise Pocket, I found myself walking alongside Corporal Dubois. Her face, usually so full of determination, now reflected a quiet contemplation. "This is just one piece of a larger puzzle," she said, gazing out at the ruined landscape. "But maybe, just maybe, it's a step towards ending this war." Our march out of the pocket was reflective, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Private Reed walked silently, his usual youthful chatter replaced by a matured silence. Sergeant Dawson moved with a weary resilience, his gaze often drifting to the empty spaces where our fallen comrades once marched beside us. As we passed through the remnants of a small village, the impact of the war on civilians was heartbreakingly evident. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and the few villagers who remained watched us with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Their lives had been irrevocably altered, their home a casualty of a war they had little part in. We reached a temporary encampment set up for us to rest before moving on. Here, the atmosphere was subdued. Medals and commendations were handed out, but they felt like small tokens in the face of what we had experienced. We were not just soldiers, we were survivors of a brutal chapter in history. That evening, around a small campfire, we shared our thoughts and feelings. It was a moment for us to bond over our shared experiences, to find solace in our collective endurance. The fire crackled in the background, a tiny beacon of warmth and light in a world that had seen so much darkness. "I don't know what the future holds," I admitted to the group, "but I do know that what we did here, in the Falaise Pocket, will stay with us forever. We fought for something greater than ourselves, and that means something." As night enveloped the camp, I lay in my tent, staring up at the canvas above me. The sounds of my fellow soldiers' quiet breathing were a reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey. We had faced unimaginable horrors together and had emerged with a bond that would never be broken. The Falaise Pocket was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the capacity for courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a chapter in the larger story of the war, a story that was still being written. But for now, in the aftermath of the battle, we took a moment to rest, to heal, and to reflect. Tomorrow, we would continue the fight, carrying with us the memories of the Falaise Pocket, a stark reminder of the cost of war and the enduring hope for peace.